Hello, my brothers and sisters in Christ. Boniface here with Unam Sanctam Catholicam. Undoubtedly, by now, you've all heard the news that Bishop Strickland of the Diocese of Tyler, Texas, has been sacked by Pope Francis. And I think those of us who have been paying attention probably all saw this coming. We're deep enough into this pontificate that we know what it means when you get an apostolic visitation from Pope Francis, right? We know what that implies. It means that some sort of punitive action is forthcoming, and basically the apostolic visitation is just setting up the pretext for it. So I think we all knew that this was going to happen at some point, and so the axe has fallen today. I am deeply, deeply saddened by this. It is manifestly unjust. It is brazenly unjust, and I mean, in the past, you guys know I'm not the sort of person to just rush in and knee jerk uh, take sides on issues like this, or just kind of knee jerk come to people's defense when I don't know all the details. You might remember in a previous video on the laicization of Father Pavone. Um, I did find some problematic issues with Father Pavone, so I wasn't entirely on one side or the other with it. But this case is just so manifestly wrong, that it's sickening, and it's evidence of how bad things are right now. And I've had a lot of thoughts about this. I've spent the morning, I spent the morning outside doing things, just kind of working and turning this over in my head and reading some other takes from people. And I wanted to share just a few thoughts about this, and maybe where to go from here and what to take away from it. Now, in the first place, regarding the ostensible reason for the apostolic visitation, that is like the financial irregularities and problems in the management of the diocese, I don't believe that for a second. And the reason I don't believe it is simply because, had the apostolic visitation actually uncovered evidence of gross malfeasance or very grievous disorders in the management of the diocese, undoubtedly the Vatican would have released those details as part of the justification for the removal of Bishop Strickland. But the fact that the Vatican didn't bring anything forward, and that nothing's ever been released, that tells you that they don't have any smoking gun. If they had a smoking gun, they would show the smoking gun to justify this action. They would have publicized it. Now, is the Diocese of Tyler perfect, flawless in a financial standpoint? Probably not. From what I can gather, the Diocese of Tyler is no better or no worse than most other dioceses financially. But there's no grievous financial irregularities or malfeasance. Again, no smoking gun, or else they would have come forward with it. Now, but more to the point here. So let's say we're going to run with that story anyways and say, okay, financial irregularities. So are we going to start? Is that the precedent now? We're going to remove bishops from every diocese where the finances aren't perfectly in order? Oh my gosh, I can think of, how many dioceses are going to be compromised if that's the precedent. We're going to remove bishops where your finances aren't properly in order. We've got some bad dioceses in terms of how their finances are managed, but I bet the worst ones aren't in the United States. In fact, I'm willing to bet that the dioceses with some of the most corrupt finances, well, I don't know. I don't want to call out countries by name that I don't know the details of, but it's probably in the country shaped like a boot. If you ever thought, Francis, of looking into the dioceses in that boot shaped country? I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of corruption there. Or what about in Germany or places like this, right? So the idea that we're going to ignore this sorts of financial corruption in far worse dioceses, and then we're going to like nitpick about little irregularities over in Tyler, Texas, it's just nonsense. And we can see that it's not consistent at all. There's no consistency to how this the standard is being applied. So this is just another reason why I do not accept this explanation about financial improprieties and mismanagement in the diocese. But Boniface, Bishop Strickland, is guilty of criticizing the Pope, and is thus justly deserving of the punishment that hath been meted out upon him. Okay, so he has been a vocal critic of Pope Francis, but merely criticizing the Pope is not grounds to remove a bishop from his office. Now, you might argue from Canon, what is it here? Check my notes. Canon 1373 that says bishops can be removed for stirring up hatred of the faithful against the apostolic see or urging them to acts of disobedience. Now, of course, Bishop Strickland has not incited anyone to disobey. He has never once told any of the faithful to disobey the Pope. And as far as inciting hatred, okay, how is merely being a critic of this pontificate inciting hatred? Um, I mean, he made a tweet that said that Francis was deviating from the Catholic faith. Is that inciting hatred? If that is inciting hatred, then we're going to have to admit that Saint Paul is guilty of inciting hatred when he said the same thing to Saint Peter in Galatians 2. It is clearly not part of our tradition or our theology that to correct someone or to disagree with someone is to incite hatred against them. I would think that the threshold for inciting hatred is going to be much higher than that. And again, even if the issue is criticizing the Pope or urging the faithful to disobedience, this is being applied extremely inconsistently. A little historical reminder: the infamous Archbishop Rembert Weekland, who broke his vow of celibacy in a same sex affair, was a vociferous public critic of John Paul II and then Cardinal Ratzinger as prefect of the CDF. He criticized them very uncharitably over the document Dominus Jesus. And despite all his criticisms, he kept his job until retirement age of 2002. And how many other dissenting bishops who criticized John Paul II or Benedict XVI did the same? Or what about the bishops today in Germany who are telling Francis that they don't care what he says? They're going to go ahead with their own interpretation of the synodal way, and they're pushing the German church into actual schism. Why haven't any of them been disciplined? Now, I'm not saying this, as an instance of whataboutism, but I'm trying to point out that even if we are saying the issue is disobedience to the Pope, this is something that only gets addressed when it's on one side and not the other. Basically, it's only a problem if you aren't on board with the Pope from the traditionalist side. But if you're not on board with the Pope from the liberal or progressive side, that just gets entirely overlooked. Which, even if Joseph Strickland had his problems, and I'm not saying he did, but let's just say that he did, that would still make this unjust because it's a law that's being applied inconsistently to target specific people of a certain ideological bent within the church, which of course is a deviation from justice. This really speaks to a larger issue, which is that the modern church has a real problem with the concept of authority, which is that we really do seem to be acting as if might makes right. There is this worship of power almost. We are all Machiavellians now in the Catholic Church, where the ability to do something is the justification for doing it. Of course, to have jurisdiction to do something does not justify you in doing it. The potential to act cannot be the rationale for why you act. And I know I'm seeing arguments that, like, well, the Pope doesn't actually have the jurisdiction to do this. I don't feel competent enough to comment on that. I can say that this has not been the custom in the church, and he's definitely going against tradition by doing this. But to get back to this Machiavellian point, to have the authority to do something does not justify you in doing it. And we understand this on a natural level. Like, for example, I'm a father. I have kids in the house, and if I wanted to, I could go into my daughter's bedroom every single day and I could ransack all her stuff. I could open every drawer, throw out everything. I could open all her diaries, look through them, go through everything under her bed. I could say, hand over your phone. I could look through everything that she has. I could do that if I wanted every single day because it's my house. I'm the pater familias. This is all my stuff. She's a minor legally, so none of that stuff's hers. If I wanted to, I could do that. I'd be within my legal rights. But is that just for me to do that? Does anybody really do that to their kid, just for the heck of it? No, I would hope not. I'm sure there's probably some parents who do, but that'd be tyrannical of me. Um, when I was growing up, my parents respected my privacy enough to not go through my stuff when I was a teenager, or at least they didn't tell me about it. And so I would never do that to her, because I value her privacy and I value that she has some autonomy. I might have a legal right over the objects in this house, but I value her autonomy and individuality as a person and her sense of wanting to be secure in my household and in her own little corner of the world that is her home, her bedroom, which for a teenager is everything. So therefore, I would not just go up and ransack her room unless I had grave cause to do so. Much less would I assert as rationale to do it that I can do it just because I can. That's not a defense, and it shouldn't be a defense. So we've all kind of been brainwashed with this Machiavellian approach to power, where the mere fact that the Pope can do something becomes the justification for him doing it. And that's a very profoundly wrong and untraditional way to view the powers of the papacy. I've been critical of Pope Francis throughout his pontificate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I align myself with every other critic of the Pope. There's some that I like, and there's some that I don't like. I very much like Athanasius Schneider. I like Cardinal Mueller. I don't like Archbishop Vigano, and I don't like Father James Altman, for example. So I don't just knee jerk accept or align myself with anyone who is a critic of the Pope. That's not the sole criteria of whether I think someone's on the right track or not. Obviously, when Bishop Strickland first started making news earlier in the year, I didn't really know what to think of him or where to place him. I went to the Catholic Identity Conference in Pittsburgh back in October, and Bishop Strickland, of course, was the surprise speaker. I say surprise because everybody there kind of knew it was going to be. We're like, who else could it be? So I was there. I saw from what I can tell, was his first public Latin Mass, which was beautiful. But anyhow, when Bishop Strickland spoke, I was not sure what to expect. I wasn't sure what it was going to be like, and was it going to be something that was bitter and angry and unhinged? Some friends of mine were saying like, "Oh, Strickland's going to be there. You're going to see some unhinged, angry, sniping, like that. He was just going to get up there and trash the Pope." And I didn't know what to expect. And he gave his talk, and it was a beautiful talk on the importance of the Blessed Mother in the life of the church. He didn't mention the Pope at all. He didn't throw any bombs. It wasn't incendiary. It was a beautiful talk that any Catholic would feel grateful to hear. It was like I would have loved to hear a homily like that, at any point. I was so impressed with his talk, with his general demeanor. He was humble. He was approachable. He did not give off that bad news vibe. Sometimes you run across a personality and you're like, oh, this person is a firebomb. Like this person is bad news. Even if they're saying things that maybe are on the side that you sympathize with, you just get the feeling like, I'm going to keep my arm's length from this person. He did not give off that vibe at all. From what I could tell, he was an ideal pastor. He had a pastoral heart. And, Pope Francis talks a lot about going to the peripheries and the shepherd smelling of the sheep. Bishop Strickland smelled like the sheep. It says in the Gospel of John Christ says that the sheep will recognize the master's voice. I could recognize the master's voice in Bishop Strickland's words, and I was deeply impressed by the man. So now, obviously, my own vibes that I got from him aren't the objective criteria of all things, But I'm just saying, after having personally encountered the man, I was so impressed with him, and it just further reinforces my thinking that this is manifestly unjust. Now, as far as the Vatican is concerned, this is a huge L for Pope Francis. This makes him look awful. You do not make a martyr out of someone who is willing to be a martyr. Whatever negative consequences were happening from Bishop Strickland's mean tweets, they are infinitesimal compared to how bad the situation is now that you have sacked him. It just reinforces everybody's sneaking suspicion that you, Pope Francis, are in fact an autocrat and governing the church in a tyrannical fashion. If I was any one of the bishops of the world looking on right now watching this, I would be gravely alarmed, because this is demonstrating that the Pope views the bishops not as legitimate authorities in their own right, but as mere at-will employees of the papacy, as branch managers of CEO Pope Francis, which is a very improper, unhistorical, theologically incorrect view of the episcopacy, and may I mention, extremely contrary to Vatican II. This is like the opposite of what Vatican II envisioned with collegiality, making the bishops just at-will employees of the Pope. If anything, the fathers of the Second Vatican Council were intentionally trying to move away from any such notion. So what an irony! Is this more of the spirit of Vatican II? Um, uh, who's to say? But we have to look at this and apply the principle that an injustice anywhere is an attack on justice everywhere. So if we stand by and support the firing of Bishop Strickland, it is basically affirming the principle that the Pope can fire any bishop at anywhere at any point for any reason, and that is a grave injustice, and that is not the way the church has been managed. That is not the proper theological understanding of the Pope in his relation to the episcopacy, even according to Vatican II. This brings up an interesting question, though, which is that how do you remove a problematic bishop? Because I'm certainly not suggesting that you can never get rid of a bishop. Current canon law provides reasons why a bishop can be sacked and how to go about it. But I think it's interesting to take a look at this historically, and to point out something that is really missing in our church today, which is a lot of these intermediary bodies that used to exercise governing functions in the church in pre-modern times. So, for example, in the old days, and I'm talking about like maybe the Middle Ages or going into the early modern period, you would have an entity known as the cathedral chapter, which was the canons of the cathedral, who functions sort of as an episcopal curia to a bishop. Now, if there was a problem with a let's say a tyrannical or corrupt bishop in a diocese, and he was alienating everybody in his diocese, mismanaging the diocese, um, the cathedral chapter could take action. They would often call an assembly, and they could drive the bishop out. Now they couldn't do that of their own authority. They would have to appeal to their metropolitan, because remember, there's a structure to dioceses. Dioceses are your regular dioceses are suffragans to larger metropolitan dioceses. So what would also often happen in the Middle Ages, you got like a corrupt bishop who's practicing nepotism or just pilfering the church or whatever, and he angered too many people in the diocese. The cathedral chapter could come together, and they could refuse to recognize him. Sometimes they would physically drive him out. They might lock the doors of the episcopal palace. They might fortify it, whatever. But they could drive him out, and then while he was driven out, they would appeal to the metropolitan to confirm their decision, and then the metropolitan might he might listen to the chapter's grievances. He might call the suffragan bishop to him to explain himself. And then the metropolitan, typically he could arbitrate amongst them and try to broker a settlement, or he could call a regional synod of all the other bishops of the ecclesiastical province. Now, this is synodality in action, how it actually functioned in history. He might call a synod to pass judgment on this brother bishop, and then if the bishop was found to be guilty of X, Y, and Z, the synod could declare him deposed. Now, in the old days, like the early Middle Ages, that would be it. They could depose him, and then typically this would be ratified by the king, because remember, in the old days, episcopal property was often held by leave of the monarch. So once the monarch confirmed this and said, you no longer have the right to episcopal property, then that effectively deposed that bishop. So you see all these different mediating bodies: the cathedral chapter, the archbishop of the metropolitan archdiocese functioning as the supreme judicial authority in the ecclesiastical region, the synod of regional bishops, and then the king ratifying the decree of the synod. But then what happened is, after the investiture controversy, when there was more of a strict separation between ecclesiastical governance and royal authority, especially with the management of church properties, you would find more and more that these synodal decrees would have to be ratified by the Pope. So you would still have the metropolitan archbishop would preside over a synod. They would depose the problematic bishop, and then they would send the acta of the synod to the Pope for his confirmation. And that's how you handle the problematic bishop. The Pope didn't really have to get involved except to read over the acts of the local synod and say, this all looks according to the canons, and then approve it. Now, sometimes you got situations where the entire diocese might be corrupt. Like, let's say that the cathedral chapter itself is corrupt, because maybe they're all sycophants of the corrupt bishop, and they're all his family members. They're supporting him. In that case, you can have the metropolitan himself step in and exercise discipline, even without being invited in by the cathedral chapter. So let's say, for example, if we're doing a true synodal model of how this should work, let's say, for example, that Joseph Strickland did have some improprieties, or at least that there was reasonable cause to assume that he did. Well, what should have happened is that the metropolitan archbishop, who in this case is the Archbishop of Galveston, Houston, who is Cardinal DiNardo. Cardinal DiNardo should have begun an investigation into the diocese, and then he should have called a regional synod of the ecclesiastical province, brought forward whatever evidence he had found, if any, and then Strickland's brother bishops should have taken a vote and passed a judgment on him, and that should have been the end of it. So, and maybe Pope Francis could have requested this of Cardinal DiNardo, but it should have been Cardinal DiNardo of the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, who was overseeing this in conjunction with his brother bishops in a synod to pass judgment on Joseph Strickland. That's the historical way this would have been handled. Instead, you have an apostolic visitation initiated by the papacy. To my knowledge, Cardinal DiNardo was not involved at all. The apostolic visitors were two retired bishops, one from Kansas, and I can't recall the other one. But they are the ones who carried out the visitation. And of course, there was no synodal tribunal. At any point in church history in the past, there would have been some sort of synod where Strickland would have been put on trial, so to speak. He would have been able to speak for himself, see the evidence, present counter evidence. The Episcopal fathers, who were his peers, would have passed judgment on him at that point. But of course, none of that happened. We get an investigation from the Vatican. The ecclesiastical province isn't involved. Strickland doesn't see the evidence against him. He just receives a judgment from the Vatican that he's deposed, and there's no canonical means for him to appeal it, because traditionally this action would have been taken by the Metropolitan Archbishop, and then the Pope was still there as a final judicial authority if he wanted to appeal to the Pope. But of course, he can't do that because the Pope stepped in right from the get-go and took the first steps. So Pope Francis kind of cut out all the intermediaries. Now, This isn't necessarily Pope Francis's fault. Cathedral chapters have been non-existent for a long time in any juridical sense, and even ecclesiastical provinces, their functionality as juridical forums has been subsumed under more like dissolved into the national episcopal conferences. You still have situations where you have to appeal something to a metropolitan archbishop, but I mean the metropolitan archbishop's authority to call a regional synod of his ecclesiastical province to pass judgment on another bishop, you don't really see that anymore. So this just shows, again, as part of a larger problem, the loss of subsidiarity in the church, the dissolution of these canonical intermediary bodies that used to arbitrate these sorts of issues, has really fed into turning the Pope into a just a CEO and the bishops into his branch managers. Now, what everybody wants to know is what now? What should Bishop Strickland do now? Well, obviously, I hope that he pursues every canonical avenue to fight this. Um, I don't know. I don't want to presume to advise the bishop on what he should do. Other than that, but I can tell you what I hope he does not do. I hope he does not become a talking head. I hope he does not go on the speaking circuit and make himself into a media personality. I hope he doesn't do what Archbishop Vigano did and start just churning out all this content. I really would. I really think that would be not the optimal way to handle this. Um, what would be cool, and what previously unjust deposed bishops have done in the past, is they take this time for networking with other bishops. Let's remember that even though he's been deprived of his office, he's not excommunicated, he's not prohibited from celebrating mass and things like that. I have an article on Unam Sanctam called "The Obedience of Saint Athanasius," and if you read this article, it talks about how when Athanasius was unjustly deposed more than one time, what he did was he took that opportunity to travel and to network and build bonds with other bishops and theologians and influential members of the church who he thought were supportive of him. In other words, he used it to kind of firm up his foundations, firm up his base of support. He traveled. He traveled to Italy. He met the Pope. He celebrated Mass in. He went to Gaul. I'm not sure, but he traveled around. He networked. He built up a support base, and he built up a body of ecclesiastical figures who had his back, so that when the time was fortuitous, when the time was right, they could support him in his reinstitution, which is what in fact happened. I think that would be cool if Bishop Strickland did that. If he said, okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to travel around. I'm going to visit all these other bishops. I'm going to visit priests. I'm going to celebrate mass with people. And I'm going to build up a network of support because clearly Pope Francis isn't going to be around forever. And eventually Bishop Strickland's hour will come. So that's what I would love to see him do. I think it will be wasted if he just starts becoming a talking head that's just going around kind of giving media sound bites, and because clearly there's a lot of episcopal alarm about the Franciscan pontificate right now. And so the timing is really optimal for Bishop Snyder to network with these other bishops. We know that part of Francis's modus operandi has been to prevent bishops and cardinals from getting together and talking to each other about what is going on. And Strickland could very much under the radar do this without further antagonizing the Vatican or anything like that publicly. He can travel around and build a network of support and start thinking for the future conclave, not in the sense of Strickland himself being a candidate. That's highly, highly unlikely. But I mean, start laying the groundwork for when the moment comes when Francis is no longer in power and the time to act is upon the church, and Strickland is helping to network and build up part of that new uh, pattern of bishops who needs to rise up to reassert themselves. And remember, the bishops don't necessarily even have to be traditionalists. The traditionalism is part of the picture here, and Strickland is just kind of new to traditionalism. He just celebrated his first Latin Mass just a month and a half ago. But I mean, from the point of view of episcopal authority, like I said, every bishop in the world should be on edge right now because of this. And I think if Strickland went around and maybe starts networking with these bishops about this issue and building his support base in the model of what Saint Athanasius did when he was unjustly deposed. There could be an organized structure of support going into the next conclave or into the next papacy to get some of these issues addressed. So I think that would be really cool, and probably strategically what would be the best use of his time and talents right now. So that's about it. I mean, there's more that could be said, but I feel like I'm just starting to ramble. So we can wrap it up now. But let's just remember that God is still in control of this. This is Christ's church. And this sort of thing has happened before. I mean, St. Athanasius was exiled unjustly multiple times, not just once. So this is a thing that happens, and church history can be messy. And we're living through extraordinary times right now. We are living through times that future church historians will write about, just like the way we write about the Arian controversy or the struggles of the investiture period. So, what a time to be alive. And let's just all remember this in our prayers, stick to our devotions, keep pursuing holiness, um, support Strickland in what ways we are able, support holy priests and bishops, and continue to pray for the church that it will better reflect the image of Christ, her bridegroom. Hey, before you go, I wanted to take a moment to draw your attention to a new book I've been reading that is simply fantastic, and that is When the Sickle Swings by Kristen Van Uden, Stories of Catholics Who Survived Communist Oppression, published by Sophia Institute Press. I know Kristen personally. She's one of my editors over at Catholic Exchange, and she's done a phenomenal service to the church with this book. And what Kristen did was she went around and she interviewed survivors of communism, Catholics who had survived persecution under various communist regimes. She collected their stories and put them together in this lovely little book. The book is organized according to regions. So you have sections on Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, etc. And it's just so important to preserve these stories, these firsthand accounts of these Catholics, many of them who are elderly today, who suffered grievously under the Antichrist system of communism. So she did a tremendous job with the book. It's fascinating. It's historically, it's interesting history. It's engaging. It's edifying, and it's very important to preserve these stories because today, especially in the West, people tend to forget what an antichrist system communism is and how awful it is, and what it means for Catholics living under it. And so if you're looking for something that is edifying, maybe a little bit historical, very well written, but not too long, I highly recommend you get a copy of Kristen Van Uden's When the Sickle Swings from Sophia Institute Press, and I will put a link to the book down below in the description. All right, that's it. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. May God richly bless you.